Hi, what I'll be doing is sharing and going through the settlement dynamics unit, which is the most recent unit we have done, and accompanying this video will be this list of key questions here. So when I'm going through the video today on settlements, what I would like you to do is answer these questions. So I'm going to go through them in order of these questions, so you're more than welcome to stop and pause the video at any point, go back, rewind, as well. What I'm doing is stop me repeating myself, and also you can ask me any questions during the lesson if you still don't understand these questions on here. Won't be going through the whole unit today because we haven't quite finished it, and we'll be finishing it in the next couple of weeks. But I just wanted to make sure that we had a good recap on where we got up to last term. So without further ado, I'll start going through. So this unit, Unit 6, Settlement Dynamics, normally the unit people don't choose for their longer 15-mark questions, but unit we still need to know for our shorter 10-mark questions. It starts off with the problems in rural areas. We look at rural areas in both poor countries, LICs, and rich countries, HICs. First things we look at what the kind of factors which lead to the problems caused in LICs. So this is first the question here, what are the main problems in LICs? In rural areas, unemployment, underemployment, jobs that pay quite poorly, so primary resources like agriculture is one. Population growth, sometimes population growth is incredibly high. Okay, in places of Africa, nearly fertility rate can be above 7. Okay, and that's for kids to work on the farm, and because their life expense is very low. But that population growth leads to demand on food and other services. Lots of rural to urban migration, so people fleeing this rural life for a better life in the city. So lots of this urban-rural migration going on, and normally low investment. They don't have the capital, they don't have the services that normal cities and towns would be, all cause these problems within LICs. Now, if we kind of go on from this and have a look at the next question, what provisions further add to these problems? Well, obviously, we've got lots of different things here. It goes on to about disease makes a big issue. So like Ebola, AIDS, HIV and so on is a massive issue. It gives you loads of case studies about how much it kills here, malaria as well. Wars, government and corruption. So if you look at Congo, Sudan, Syria, places like that, it's not going to help either. But this is the main bit. The second question is also these provisions really struggle as well in rural LICs. They really struggle to get clean pipe water. They really struggle to have proper sewage, electricity, roads, clinics and schools. Remember I said there's a not Top Gear, but the Grand Tour episode where they try and get provisions or fish into kind of Central Africa from the coast. It's impossible really because of the types of roads, and they don't have refrigerated trucks and storage units like we do in the UK, so it's a lot difficult. Some people say this because of the climate and other things, but obviously you can go for that as well. You've also got to then go, well, why are they so poor and why do they stay poor? That kind of brings us to our third question here. Okay, and it's the agricultural issue. So why can we have agriculture in a rich country and the rural areas be fine, but they have agriculture in an LIC and it'd be difficult? It's normally to do with climate. Okay, so climate, disease and pests. There's soil exhaustion, overcropping. Maybe they're not educated about what to do in terms of proper farming techniques. They keep planting on the same bit of land over and over again. This is what we call soil exhaustion. Okay, we'll get all the nutrients out of the soil. They're also going to be prone to droughts and severe flooding or flash flooding, especially in places like Bangladesh. Cyclones, we can have pests, you can have locusts, things like that, disease, and increase the use of biofuels. So one of the most, this is a really strange one, but some rural LICs are using biofuels, so rapeseed oil, sugarcane and so on. They're not actually providing food for the country, but what they're doing is providing lots of money. That doesn't necessarily help the LICs and the food price crisis and problems there. Okay, so these first two problems are what are the problems basically in rural LICs environments. Then it goes on to a case study called Eufakelah here. Like I said, you're more than welcome to pause and go back for you as well. So this case study is a district in South Africa, basically, quite a poor district, and it goes on to like very small population, economy based on subsistence farming, so farming for themselves, a bit of commercial farming, and tourism within the foothills of the mountainous and volcanic South Africa. Very rich volcanic soils, like I said. A lot of rural to urban migration is going on here. Okay, we talk about the settlements, we talk about how they're really, really struggling in terms of population. We're talking about the average size of a household from 5 to 5.2. Okay, has so increased fertility rate. What are the living conditions like? Just gives you a good background to a case study in Africa. You can also look at some key facts here, which is probably the ones I get down for your question. What are the percentage population have access to lighting, cooking, pit latrines, which are toilets outside, how many people use them, not an actual proper toilet, and things like that. So have a look at Keller, a good case study to use. And then brings us on to the second bit, which is what it's like in rural HICs. Now, I'm not always going to flick back to this, so you'll need to be following this as well as the video as well. What is it like in rural HICs? Well, are completely different to LICs, isn't it? We actually see some growth. We see richer environments. Okay, we sometimes still see a decline from rural urban migration, but what we see a lot of is counter urbanization and people moving from cities to the countryside in order to gain a better life and a better quality of life as well. It's more peaceful. Tends to be a lot more expensive. Villages, elderly people instead of quite young as well. Very farming, agriculture orientated. A lot of this took part, and the decline took part a lot because of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that in HICs, a lot of the people moved from these rural environments to go to factories and cities, and these built up around these factories and cities. If we look at these settlements, they're kind of split into three different types. We have dispersed, nucleated, as we can kind of see here. So this one is dispersed. Okay, we have nucleated, and our third one we have is linear, which is just settlements along a kind of straight line or feature. Okay, so normally we can tell looking at our rural and even urban settings within this, HICs kind of have a structure to their settlements as well. And it goes through loads of reasons why or what the rural environments are like. So you're more than welcome to add some more detail there. You don't need to add too much either. Talks about your linear settlements down here as well. Okay, so make sure you're getting all that down within the questions as well. It then goes on to talk about what I've just kind of touched upon is the counter urbanization side of it. So people moving from the towns or cities, okay, to these quainter, more rural environments. Maybe they've got a family, maybe they want a more peaceful life. They tend to be within what we call commuting range. Okay, so commuting range is where you can still drive to the city or town or place of work. Okay, so people might counter urbanize, but they are still in with commuting range. Some people say this is usually within 80 to 100 kilometers of the city, but many are much closer. It doesn't tend to be further than that. You've got to think that's probably like an hour and a half drive. Some people do commute every day within commuting range. Birmingham is a good example of this. London is a good example of this. High Wycombe, Reading could be a commuter town. It's not quite a rural environment, but even Henley to a certain extent, you can get into London quite easily because that could be a good example for you. You should up to be right here, okay? And we're going to look at the impacts of counter urbanization as well. Okay, so remember, impacts are positive and negative. They don't have to just be a bad thing. Okay, so housing costs in cities allow people to sell properties, buy larger at lower price in the countryside. That's, the main reason why they tend to do it. Okay, but we can see that village services such as shops, cafes, schools, and hospitals have closed down. Bus and train services being used less and are struggling. Okay, the roads are much busier with cars. Village community life is declining. So there's people kind of doing less things. Many agricultural buildings and disuse now being renovated and turned into expensive dwellings. Up to you whether that's a good or a bad thing. And house prices, this is a big one thing for me. House prices have driven up in these rural areas. Normally quite cheap places to live or cheap places to buy a first house, and now it's become quite expensive for people to do that as well. But why are they doing it? For that increased quality of life down here. Okay, where it says increased quality of life. Again, more than welcome to pause this video, have a read yourself, and add any more detail if you want to. It's not a really hard thing. Think about the impacts of counter-urbanisation. Well, they're going to what urbanisation is. I feel in the textbook they do this kind of the opposite way around. I feel like urbanisation should come first. However, it's done in this direction. So urbanisation is the increased percentage of population living in cities. Okay? And the UK and HICs tend to be quite high. Don't worry about this case study too much. I don't really touch on it. Many people don't choose settlements, so don't worry about this one. So we should be on the kind of consequences of urbanisation today. But before we touch on that, we're going to look at what megacities and world cities are. So megacities, and also called like conurbations, tend to have a population of over 10 million people. So always remember that. So a megacity doesn't have to be the richest city, doesn't have to be the nicest city, but it needs to be big. It needs to have a population of over 10 million as well. Now, to be a world city, and we'll go into this a bit more detail, you need cultural, political and economic influence in the world. You don't have to have a population of over 10 million. Okay, so London, New York, Tokyo are all world cities. Madrid, Berlin, world cities. And you can go on kind of Shanghai, Singapore, all world cities. Some of them do have populations over 10 million, so they would be a world city and a mega city, but there is a definite definition difference between the two things here. So urbanisation, that increase in percentage of people living in cities, okay, there are some consequences of that. And if you've been into London on a normal day, you'll see that, and you'll see these consequences. If you live in London, you'll see these consequences as well. So overcrowding, so people living with relatives, not enough housing or housing becoming too expensive. People living rough on the streets because housing is too expensive, or shanty towns for favelas. Gangs using children or gangs of abandoned orphan children, as well as increased crime tends to be in poorer ones. Squatter settlements, favelas, so on in Brazil. And it kind of goes on to here as well. But why is it needed? Of course it's needed. Okay, sometimes the labour's needed, unskilled work is sometimes needed, but then you can kind of go into this as well. It might mean that more pressure on services because of the increased population. We did Manila, and we looked at Manila with all those slums and the education system. In like 20 million people live in Manila, and they had to do it in 3 systems, didn't they, to get their schools into a normal school day. Okay, so this problem of urbanisation. So think about that case of people living in graveyards and so on. So think about that problem when you're dealing with that question. We'll then go on to what happens because of urbanisation. So as urbanisation continues to happen, what tends to happen is something called suburbanisation, urban sprawl. So the inner city becomes too expensive, and therefore people want to move out of the central business district to the suburbs, okay, the surrounding areas. Detroit is a good example around New York, and you could kind of class Essex and so on around London as that as well. Okay, so urban sprawl is the spread of a city as it grows and expands. So what London's done is they put a belt, so something called the green belt. So it's really difficult to get planning permission. It's a protected area of land around London to make sure this urban sprawl or growth doesn't continue. Okay, there is this thing about ribbon development, and that's development coming along roads. Don't worry too much about that one there. Next thing here is municipal housing. Okay, municipal housing is another way for council housing or government looked after property. We tend to get this with new developments, with urban sprawl and suburbanisation as well. Cities, because they're expensive in the middle, tend to build their municipal housing on the outside or the edge. And this is called the rural to urban fringe, or the transition zone within our cities. So we should be up to this municipal housing bit, so we haven't got much to go until we fully caught up here. Okay, some other type of housing that we might find in these areas is something called infilling. Now remember, infilling is not finding a gap and putting as many houses as you can in. They read it properly here. A large house with a large garden is brought by a developer. The old house is modernised and sold on much reduced garden. The rest of the garden is used to build several market properties for the considerable profit. This is about changing already existing buildings to make more dwellings within that. So Battersea Power Station is a really good example. A Chinese company has bought that and then made it into lots of dwellings and housing as well. Obviously, they can be built on brown or greenfield sites as well. So brownfield never have previously been used and greenfield have never been built on before. Then we go on to like urban renewal. What can we do if our cities look really run down and really rubbish? We can renew them, we can update them, we can gentrify them. This can be property led, this can be government led. Greenwich Millennium Village, that's updating a place to make it more modern with the times and more modern with what the city wants. So Canary Wharf used to be a port district in London and is now a banking district instead. Okay, we didn't need that type of industry anymore. Okay, we needed industry, the tertiary to quaternary industry, which makes us more money. So we had to change and update and renew that area of London. So that's what urban renewal is. And you can get a bit more detail here if you want to look at property-led regeneration, so governments or partnership or private investors doing this as well. Might really interest you if you're into architecture and development, things like that. Here it goes into world cities. I've just discussed world cities as well. I did it with mega cities because I think it fits in there a bit better. We got 4 categories, pretty much alpha, beta, and gamma, and then you have alpha plus, alpha minus as well. But it's alpha, beta, gamma, okay, are our types of cities, and here's some nice examples of them here for you. We then have our 4 models of how we'd see a settlement. You've got the simple bid rent model here. It talks about price and how many of these things as you get closer to CBD. As you move further away, you get more of other things. We normally get lots of shops and offices and industry in the city centre, very low residential. As we move out of the city, we get more residential than anything else. And obviously you can apply this to different cities as it's shown here. You've got the Burgess concentric ring model, like I say, the dartboard, it's like it's a pub. I don't know why Burgess runs their beer, but it does. Okay, where the CBD is at the start, and then you kind of get a very rhythmical way out. You've then got your Hoyt, which is in a Y shape. The Hoyt number 5 here is the high class residential. 3 here is the low class residential. Key thing here is the high class is not near the low class or the industry. If you flip this round and do the other way, it's basically London, and this is like Kensington and Islington. Okay, and this is kind of like your Barking side. Okay, and if you flip it round, it basically creates London. The reason London's like this is because the smog that was produced in the centre would be blown out towards the poorer side of London. The richer side did not get influenced by that as well. Once you've done that, that's pretty much up to date and where we stopped off and got up to in geography in our time. Okay, and there is the retail services which we were working on and did presentations on, which is the last kind of thing we did. But we'll be going on to that later in the week, okay, and looking at a new case study of Kazakhstan in governmental planning. Hope this helps. Use this sheet, fill it in as much detail as you can. I'll be checking if you do it on the lesson. And please pause, go back, use the video as many times as you can, and ask questions you don't understand. Thank you.